Good evening. Before we begin, we will be learning from the book Nurturing Faith, published by the Kahat Publication Society as part of their Hasidic Heritage series. If you do not have a copy, click on the link on the jnet.org/mimer page to download the text. I would suggest that you download it rather than read it online. And when opening it on your computer, click to view as two pages so that you have the Hebrew and the English side by side. If you need some help with that, hopefully someone can walk you through it in the chat. In a few weeks, on the 3rd of Tammuz, this year falls on July 1st, we will observe the 20th yahrzeit of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The yahrzeit of a tzaddik is a very significant time, not only for the tzaddik, but for all of his students and followers as well. As the tzaddik ascends to greater spiritual heights, on the day his impact on the world is highlighted, he takes those who are connected to him with him, bringing them blessing and opportunity for greater spiritual growth. To take advantage by strengthening our connection to the Rebbe. One of the ways to connect is by studying his teachings. When learning his discourses and taking them to heart, we create an intellectual and emotional bond. We gain access to his mind and way of thinking and begin to see things from his perspective. When learning with the intention of having these teachings resonate, his worldview becomes our worldview. Thus, a deep connection is formed. For this reason, we will study a Hasidic discourse, a ma'amar, or a mimer in the Chabad Russian Brooklyn accent, which I will be using, taught by the Rebbe. Specifically, and perhaps most appropriately, we will study the mimer known by its opening words V'ata Tetzave, which is regarded by Chassidim as the legacy mimer, since it is the last mimer the Rebbe personally edited. In addition to being the last mimer edited and prepared for publication by the Rebbe personally handed a printed copy of this mimer to thousands of Chassidim on the eve of Purim Katan in 1992, just 2 short weeks before falling ill. In fact, here is my copy of the mimer which I merited to receive from the Rebbe, along with the $2 for charity. The Rebbe originally delivered this mimer on the Shabbat of Parshat Tetzave, the 10th of Adar 1, in February 14, 1981. The mimer is based on a famous discourse by the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, titled V'Kibul HaYehudim. The previous Rebbe's discourse is famous since due to the circumstances under which it was originally said. The previous Rebbe delivered his discourse on Purim Katan, February 16, 1927. The themes expressed in this mimer were contributing factors in the Rebbe's arrest just several months later. Our mimer, V'ata Tetzave, elaborates on some of the themes of that mimer, even revealing a deeper understanding based on its structure. Mamorim, which is plural for mimer, explore the full spectrum of mystical topics and ideas. Yet the mimer typically has a seasonal feel to it, since it would generally open with an analysis of a particular verse or teaching related to the time in which it was delivered. So while, for example, a mimer delivered on Passover might explore the broader idea of slavery and redemption, it would open with a series of questions on a passage related specifically to Passover. And it would likely close with a resolution to those questions following the lengthy discussion on broader themes. I mention this since delivered on Purim Katan, and the Torah portion read in synagogues that week was the portion of Tetzave. The mimer analyzes and explains the opening verse of the Torah portion, as well as various passages and themes from the book of Esther. Yet, despite the seasonal feel of this mimer, we will be studying it now since it offers insight into the Rebbe's message to us living in a post-Gimel Tammuz world. We will read the mimer in the original Hebrew, translating and explaining as we go along. At the end of the class, I welcome your feedback as to whether to continue reading in the Hebrew or continue in English only. You can use the chat feature to submit questions. After each chapter, we will pause for a few minutes to respond to any questions you might have. Let's begin. We're going to begin on page 27, the beginning of the mimer, Hopefully you have the PDF and you've got it all sorted out. Here we go. Ve'ata tetzaves b'nei Yisrael, and you, Moses, should command the children of Israel, v'yichoi lecha shemen zayis zach, pure olive oil, kosis lamoer, crushed for the luminary, lahales ner tamid, in flame. This is the opening verse in the Torah portion of Tetzave, as we just mentioned, and in it God instructs Moses on the process of preparing oil to be used for the lighting of the menorah in the temple. And yet the verse is worded quite peculiarly, and we're going to read the questions right now. Second paragraph. The anomalies of this verse are well known, since they've been asked in many Chassidic discourses. Typically, most commandments in the Torah, God says to Moses, command the children of Israel, or a similar phrase. In this verse, though, the Torah says, and you shall command the children of Israel. So, first of all, we have an inconsistency here. Generally, the Torah uses the term tzaves b'nei Yisrael, command them, and here it switches course and says va'ata tetzave as b'nei Yisrael. Rather than tzav, it says tetzave, and va'ata tetzave, you should command the Jewish people. But if you think about it, this question, or this change from the norm, is not just a question of verbiage, of language, but actually the implication, the meaning of the words is also different. As Rabbi continues, that if you notice that the words va'ata tetzave changes not only the words, not just the different word, but also the meaning communicated here. Because the expression va'ata tetzave and you should command implies that the command, so we need to understand. Moses is merely the messenger to convey God's Jewish people. So why then does it say va'ata tetzave, implying that Moses is the commander, when really it's God that is the commander? Moses is simply conveying the message. So question number one is, why? It's two parts. Number one, why does it change and use a different word to describe? Number two, the word that he chooses to use changes the meaning. It says that God tells Moses to convey his commandment. Here the implication is that Moses is the one commanding the Jewish people, not God. That's question number one that needs some understanding. Explanation. After these elecha, that they should bring to you, that they should bring the oil to Moshe. Because seemingly since the one kindling the menorah was the high priest, Moses' brother Aaron, why was it necessary to bring the oil to Moshe, to Moses? In other words, in the next verse, the Torah tells us that Aaron and his sons are the ones who are going to light them in. First, right before it, do we say there's some kind of a significance to the oil being brought to Moses when he's not the one who's going to be using it? It's going to be Aaron. So why does the Torah specify? Could have left it out entirely, not mentioned anything. Could have just said, prepare the oil. But why is it the oil be brought to Moshe? Gam tzarech lahavin. A third question. We need to understand, Masha Kosev Shemen Goimer Kosis Lamoyer. We translated the words Kosis Lamoyer, crushed for the luminary, which in English makes about as much sense as it does in Hebrew. In the original, what does it mean, crushed for the luminary? It should have said oil lahoyer, to illuminate. That would have been more appropriate. In other words, the menorah, the point of the menorah, the purpose of lighting the menorah was for the menorah to give illumination, to give off light, right? From the light, the entire world. So the point is, luminary means the source of light from which the illumination comes. So the oil is prepared to light the menorah for it to be illuminated. Why then does it say crushed for the luminary? Finally, a fourth question. We also have to understand in the very next verse in the parsha, it says that the menorah is lit me'erev ad boker, from evening till morning, and yet in our verse it says a constant flame, that the oil is lit, crushed, prepared, crushed for the luminary lahales ner tamid, to raise up a constant flame. So which one is it? Is it a constant flame, meaning that it's burning constantly, or is it burning from evening till morning? So to recap the four questions that we've asked on the opening verse, number one, why do we switch from the normal expression of tzav to tetzave, which not only is a different expression, but is also it changes the meaning, which means that it implies that Moshe is the one commanding. Question number two is, why does it say to bring the oil to Moshe? What possible purpose is there in bringing the oil specifically to Moshe? Number three is, what is the meaning of the term crushed for the luminary, crushed for the source of light, when it should have said crushed for illumination, to illuminate? And number four, here in our verse it says a constant flame, that the menorah, implying the menorah burns constantly, whereas in the very next verse it says that the menorah burns from evening till morning. So now that we've concluded chapter 1, we will pause briefly and we'll take a look at the chat here, see if there are any questions. Looks quiet to me. Okay. I guess that was pretty straightforward. We're going to continue now with chapter 2. Chapter 2, page 31. So my father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, explains in his discourse, in his famous discourse, titled V'kibul HaYehudim, which was said on Purim Katan in the year 1927, Tetzave, that the Hebrew word for command, Tetzave, means binding and uniting. So generally the word tzav means command. Similarly, the word mitzvah means command. But the word mitzvah or tzav or tetzave also connotes the idea of connecting, of uniting. This then is the meaning of the words in the verse, you shall command the Jewish people. Not that Moshe should command them, but Moshe hu mekasher hu mechaber es bnei Yisrael im oren sof. Rather, it's that Moshe Tetzave connects the Jewish people with the infinite light. The infinite light is a Kabbalistic term to describe the expression of God's essence. It's termed the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light. God in his essence would be described as Ein Sof, the infinite, because he's beyond any sort of definition. So the Or Ein Sof means with God's infinite light. Essentially what we're saying is that Moses connects the Jewish people with God. So we've reinterpreted or retranslated the opening words of the verse. And now this will help us with the next part of the verse. So through this which Moshe influences the Jewish people, that he connects them with the Or Ein Sof, with God. This brings about an enhancement in Moshe's spiritual standing. So we've now explained, so to speak, we've sort of answered the first two questions. Why do we switch from tzav to tetzave? which implies that Moshe is commanding. So we explain it's not that Moshe is commanding the Jewish people, it's that he's connecting the Jewish people. He is, in fact, the Tetzave, the connector of the Jewish people with God. And through doing that, we can understand why the verse, once we've explained that, we understand why the verse says, V'yichoi lecha, that they bring to Moshe. Why? Because through Moshe doing his job of connecting the Jewish people with God, Moshe is enhanced. And so this oil, there's some spiritual benefit that's expressed or alluded to in this, the concept of the oil, that represents Moshe's enhancement. Now, in the brackets, the Rabbi explains how it's possible that the Jewish people can enhance Moshe's spiritual standing. In other words, if Moshe is the leader of the Jewish people, meaning that spiritually he is superior to them or above them, then how is it possible that they can bring about an enhancement in Moshe's status if they're beneath him? So the Rebbe gives an example based on a verse, which we'll read shortly, of the head and the feet. The head is the leader of the body. The head is the part of the body from which the body receives its instruction and guidance. The head is where the intellect is. The head is where the mind, the brain is, that controls the body. And yet, if the head wants to go to the supermarket, it can't get there without the feet. So in other words, the head might want to go somewhere, might desire to go somewhere, and even will direct the body there, but it's the body or the feet that carry the head to where it needs to go. So we see that though the feet are inferior to the head, yet the feet bring about an enhancement in the head, or help the head reach its fulfillment, fulfill that which it wants to accomplish. And this is based, this analogy of Moshe being the head, the Jewish people being the foot, is based on a verse where Moshe essentially says the same thing. The Moshe v'Yisrael dugmas reish v'regel. Moses and the Jewish people are compared to a head and foot. As the verse says, in the book of Numbers, when the Jewish people complained in the desert that they wanted meat, and God was upset with them and was frustrated with them, God eventually says he's going to give them meat, and they're going to regret it. And Moshe complains and says he doesn't think that God will be able to satisfy their lust and the desire. And but the words he uses to describe this or to express this are Sheish Meis Elef Ragli Ha'am Asher Anochi Bekirbai, which translated simply means I am in the midst of 600,000 people, or the nation of 600,000 that I am within. But the terms he uses are Sheish Meis Elef Ragli, 600,000 feet, to translate it literally, Ha'am, the nation, Asher Anochi Bekirbai, which I am in their midst. So the verse seems a bit disjointed. So now we're going to give it a Hasidic interpretation and a literal translation and reading of this verse. The Kol Yisrael Hem Raglaim de Moshe. All of Israel are the feet of Moshe. That's why he says Sheish Meis Elef Ragli, my 600,000 feet. The Jewish people are my feet. Moshe, who are Moshe is their head. Moshe ba'adam. In a person, just like in a person, the feet carry the mind, the head, to the place where it wants to go but can't get to on its own. So too is with Moses and Israel. Through Israel, the feet of Moshe, Moshe is enhanced. This then is the new translation here, the deeper meaning of the verse Sheish Meis Elef Ragli Ha'am Asher Anochi Bekirbai, that shall yidei Ragli Ha'am, through my feet, meaning my nation, Nimshach Hagiloi de Anochi Bekirbai Shel Moshe. There is a revelation in Moshe of the level of Anochi. What does this mean? So in this simple understanding of the verse, Asher Anochi Bekirbai, I am in their midst, that's referring to Moshe. Moshe says, Anochi, I am in the midst of these 600,000 people. But here we're translating it differently, two different things. First part is, Moshe says, Sheish Meis Elef Ragli, 600,000 feet, which is who? Ha'am, my nation. They are my feet, and it's through my feet, meaning the nation that Anochi representing the highest level of God, is Bekir Boy, is within Moses, within Moshe. So Moshe is saying, is expressing the contribution the Jewish people make, that through them, in order for Moshe to reach this higher spiritual level, where God, as he is Anoichi, is within Moshe, that happens through his feet, through the Jewish people. Just briefly, the idea of Anoichi represents a level of God that's beyond description, beyond definition. We know that God has many names, the highest name being the four-lettered name of God that we don't pronounce. But all these levels are descriptions of God, and if they're descriptions, then they're not the highest level. When we talk about Anoichi, simply I, that represents a level of God that's beyond description. So Moshe is saying that he is going to merit to have within him this level of I, of God, the Anoichi of God, within Moshe. And how is that? That's through the Sheish Me'es Elef Ragli, through the 600,000 feet, through the people. So we see Moshe himself says that through the people, he is enhanced. So now, this then is the meaning of the verse. That you shall connect the Jewish people, and you shall bring, and they shall bring to you a pure olive oil through Moshe, connecting the Jewish people with God. Through this, the Jewish people will bring pure oil to Moshe, meaning what? They'll bring to you. They will bring more spiritual light to Moshe. So as we said before, we've answered the first two questions as to why the Torah chooses to use the term Tetzave, implying that Moshe is the commander. Since Moshe here is not that he's the commander of the mitzvah, but he's the one who connects the Jews with God. And we'll discuss this idea of Moshe connecting the Jews with God. This theme and concept will be discussed in later classes. And it's through Moshe doing his job, by bringing out the connection of the Jewish people with God, that Moshe's spiritual level is enhanced. The Jewish people add light to Moshe. Before we begin chapter 3, let's take a look and see if we have any questions in the chat. Unless I'm doing something wrong here, I think it's quiet. So we'll leave it another moment, and we will continue momentarily with chapter 3. I apologize if I put anybody to sleep. Okay. Let's continue now. So we've said that Moshe connects the Jewish people with God, and through this he's enhanced. This obviously requires a little bit more explanation. So chapter 3 will explore this theme a little further. Well, so in order to explain what we mentioned above, that Moshe connects the Jewish people with God, and that through that he is enhanced. The previous Rebbe, in order to explain this, prefaces it in his discourse from 1927 the following. He says, that Moshe is called Raya Mehemna. This is the term that that is used to describe Moshe primarily in the Zohar. Moshe is referred to as the Raya Mehemna. The Shnei Pirushim is that there are two meanings in this term Raya Mehemna, which translates as faithful shepherd. So faithful shepherd has two meanings. Number one, Shehu Roya Nemon Shal Yisrael. Number one is that he is a faithful shepherd, meaning he's faithful, he's trustworthy to get the job done, to do what he needs to do. That's number one. He's the trusted shepherd. And number two, Vishu Zonu Mefarnes es Yisrael be'inyan ha'amunah. That Moshe feeds and sustains Israel in the matters of faith. Meaning, not that he's a faithful shepherd, but that he shepherds faith. And shepherding faith means, just as a shepherd feeds his flock, tends to his flock and nurtures them, feeds them, Moshe feeds the Jewish people faith. What does this mean? The natural faith that every Jew possesses. As we know that the Jewish people are called believers, the children of believers, the Talmud says. This idea of our being believers, children of believers, so this concept of belief is some transcendent state, something that is not impactful in our conscious lives. That which Moshe shepherds and sustains the Jews with emunah, with faith, means that he takes this emunah, which could be detached from the person, that doesn't impact him on a conscious level, and he brings it b'pnimius. It's something that he should feel and experience on a conscious level. What does this mean? So the Talmud gives an example of a thief who, before breaking into a home to steal, prays to God that he be successful. So here we have an example of faith that is makif, faith that remains detached from the person, that doesn't impact him. This is an individual who clearly has a very strong faith in God, a very big faith in God, because not only does he believe that there is a God, but he believes that God hears his prayers, and not only that God hears his prayers, but that God can actually help him. So God manipulates nature, or can manipulate it if he wants to bring about whatever he wants. And so he believes also that his prayer has the power to bring about this change. So this is a person who has not an abstract belief in God, but a very specific one, a very definite one, a very strong one, in which he believes that God is intimately involved in the inner workings of the world. And yet, the fact that God says in the Torah not to steal doesn't seem to faze him in any way, and he's about to go ahead and steal. So here's somebody who has a faith, a very strong faith, and yet the faith remains makif. It's aloof. It's not something that impacts him on a conscious level. And this is true not only of thieves, but anybody. We all have natural faith in God, and we all believe in God, and yet each in our own lives know that sometimes we behave in ways that doesn't bear out this faith in God. In whatever way, sometimes it's in a sin, and sometimes it's not even in a sin. It's just in an attitude or a feeling or an emotion that shows that the faith that we have in God doesn't somehow connect or impact us on a conscious level. So this then is the role of Moshe. When we say that he shepherds faith, that he brings this faith, he feeds them the faith. Feeding, when we eat, the food that we eat becomes part of us. It enters into our bodies, it enters into the bloodstream. You are what you eat. So eating is something that is what we call pnimius. It's something that, so where we have garments, clothing, food goes inside and becomes a part of us. It doesn't remain separate, separate from us. It becomes a part of us. And so Moshe's role is to feed the Jewish people faith. In other words, to take this faith, which is abstract, which is it becomes part of their conscious selves, that it informs their behavior. This helps us understand what the Zohar writes. That the supernal faith, yitzan v'yisparnis minei al. The supernal faith will be fed and sustained by you, Moshe. What does it mean that the supernal faith will be fed and sustained by you? What is the term fed and sustained? It means that he brings this faith that remains detached, and he brings it in, that it affects us and on a conscious level, and that we actually experience it. And he continues in the discourse, that which we say that Moshe is the faithful shepherd, or really the definition that we're going with here in this mimer, that he shepherds faith, that this role of Moshe as a shepherd of faith applies not only to Moshe himself, but also to the offshoot of Moshe of every generation. That the leaders of the Jewish people in every generation, they strengthen the faith of the Jewish people of their generation, that their faith should be conscious. They should feel it on a conscious level. And the previous Rebbe continues in his mimer, and he gives an example. Kamei Mordechai, as Mordechai, the hero of the Purim story, along with Esther, the two heroes of the Purim story. So Mordechai, Shahoya Ispashtusa de Moshe Shebedoire. Moshe was the offshoot, the Moshe of his generation. Kamei Rabbeinu Yisrael Zechron Levracha, as our sages tell us in the Medrash. Shemordechai Bedoire Moshe Bedoire, that Mordechai in his generation was like Moshe in his generation, Shegam Bizman Gzeiras Haman, that even during the time of the decree of the wicked Haman, that learning Torah and fulfilling mitzvahs at that time, during the time Jewish people faced total annihilation, required, in order to study Torah and to observe the mitzvahs, that required Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice, even though it was dangerous and even though it was life-threatening. So Mordechai gathered groups in public to strengthen the faith of the Jewish people in God, and to stand steadfast and strong in their study of Torah and their commitment and fulfillment of the commandments of the mitzvahs. So, after this lengthy explanation in the previous Rebbe's Mimer from 1927, where he explains that Moshe and his offshoot in every generation strengthens the faith of the Jewish people in their generation, so he explains the anomaly that we pointed out in chapter 1 in the verse, where it says Shem and Lamoir, Shem and Kosis Lamoir, crushed for a luminary, Lamoir v'loy loir, like we pointed out that it says for the luminary rather than what it should have seemingly said, which is to illuminate, Shebizman HaGolus, that in the time of exile, Shekol Echad Ve'echad Nishbar V'nitke, every person is broken and crushed. Kosis, through being crushed and broken in exile, being kosis, being crushed, through that we reach the source of the light from which the light comes. So in other words, the term kosis lamoir, crushed, for the luminary, when the people are kosis, when they are crushed, they reach the moir. Not that they simply shine, but that they reach the level of moir, essence from which the light comes forth. So perhaps we've answered our third question. The third question is, why does it say la moir and not la hoir? And so the answer is because kosis implies a crushing, being crushed in exile, and it's through kosis, through being crushed in exile, and we then arrive at this level of essence. We need to understand we need to understand the connection between the explanation on kosis lamor, that broken in exile we reach the source of light, with that which he explains in the Mimer in 1927, the previous Rebbe's Mimer Lifneza. Before this point, he explained that Moshe and his offshoot in every generation feed and nurture this and sustain the faith of the people, causing it to be felt on a conscious level. So in other words, it seems that the previous Rebbe in his Mimer goes into a lengthy explanation about Mordechai being the offshoot of Moshe, being the Moshe of his generation, and just as Moshe, so too every generation, the leaders of that generation strengthen the faith of the Jewish people to stand strong in their observance of Torah mitzvahs, even at the face of hardships and challenges. And so therefore we see that he's bringing the emunah, he's causing their faith to be expressed on a conscious level, where their faith is now not something that's separate from them. They believe in God, and yet they do whatever their enemies tell them to do, but that this faith informs them, and through Moshe it strengthens them and emboldens them not to give in and not to bow to those pressures. Then, after this, the previous Rebbe explains that kosis, through being crushed, we reach the essence from which the light emanates. So there seems to be no connection between these two topics. First topic is Moshe's role in strengthening the faith of the Jewish people, and the second one is that in order to reach essence, that happens through being crushed in exile. And yet, in the structure of the previous Rebbe's Maimer, this idea of kosis, which seems to be its own independent idea and thought, its own answer to a question that has no connection, seemingly, to what was explained previously. But in the structure of the Maimer, where this explanation of kosis lamar, that being crushed brings to the essence of light, the source of the light, since he brings it after explaining the role of Moshe, there needs to be, we must say that there's a connection between them. We need to understand what that connection is. Before we begin chapter 4, let's take a look. Of Noichi within him, addressed a bit in the footnote here. Let's see. There's a note here where he note 20. So in note 20, he discusses it. It's some Kabbalistic concept that so that we don't get sidetracked and that we have an opportunity to finish the next chapter, chapter 4, in this lesson. But you can take a look at note 20 and the sources cited there. The relevant point that he makes about from that verse and the concept of Asher Noichi B'Kirbi is simply that we see that the Jewish people can enhance Moshe, can contribute to Moshe and enhance his own spiritual standing. That's the point that's relevant to what we're discussing here. I'll give it another moment, and then we will continue with chapter 4. Okay, chapter 4, page 39. So we finished chapter 3 with a question that there seems that we're sensing that there's a connection between the concept of being crushed in exile with the idea that Mordechai, who is the Moshe of his generation, and every subsequent leader of the Jewish people in their generation, strengthen the faith of the Jewish people. Specifically, what that means is that he brings what is abstract into them on a conscious level, that it informs their conscious behavior. So, in the Maimer, a simple reading where we've answered the question, the third question we asked in chapter 1. Yet there seems to be more to the story, since the implication is in the structure of the previous Rebbe's Maimer that this idea of being crushed, and through being crushed, we reach the essence of light, the essence, the source of the light, the essence of the soul. That is somehow connected with the idea that Moshe nurtures the faith of the Jewish people. So in order to answer that question, in chapter 4, we're going to continue exploring more of this Purim theme and the role that Mordechai played as the leader of his generation. And just to point out, I didn't mention this earlier, but in the previous Rebbe's Maimer from 1927, he addresses both of these themes as well. He begins the Maimer with V'kibel HaYehudim and discusses that, and then he launches into a discussion about the Tetzave, where he also asks the questions that we've asked here in our Maimer. So sort of the order is a bit reversed in terms of the title and the next subject that he introduces. So We're now going to continue with chapter 4, page 39. The explanation that the previous Rebbe gives in this verse that we began our Maimer with, his understanding of the verse Va'ata Tetzave comes in his Maimer as after what he discusses at the beginning of the Maimer, which again we mentioned the title of that Maimer is V'Kibel HaYehudim, where he explains the Perish V'Kibel HaYehudim es asher echelu lasos. He explains that the meaning of the verse in the Megillah, in the book of Esther, that V'Kibel HaYehudim es asher echelu lasos, that the Jewish people accepted what they had begun to observe. Hu shekiblu ma shehechelu b'hazman d'matan Torah. This means, what does it mean that the people accepted what they had begun to observe? It means that they accepted what they had begun at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. So in other words, the b'matan Torah hoisa haschala heichelu lasos, that at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, long before the episode of Purim, the Jewish people only began. That was only the beginning. But in the days of Achashverosh, Bisman Gzeir Haman, specifically in the time of the decree of Haman, Hoisa HaKabbalah, that's when there was the acceptance, the Kibel HaYehudim. That's the meaning in the verse, the Kibel HaYehudim. They accepted that which they began. At the time of Purim, they accepted what they had begun at the time of the giving of the Torah. This is similar to what the way the Talmud interprets another verse in the book of Esther, where it says, Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim, the Jews established and accepted. So the Talmud in Shabbos, it has a lengthy discussion about this topic. It's a very fascinating subject there, where it discusses Kimu Masha Kiblu Kfar, that they accepted what they started earlier at the giving of the Torah. What does that mean? That which the Jewish people at the time of the giving of the Torah prefaced, we will do till we will hear, rather when God offers them the Torah, rather than say, let's hear what it says, and then we'll think about whether we want to do it. They accepted it unconditionally. They said, we will do, then we'll hear. If you're giving it, we're going to take it. But that, which was great, and for that the Jewish people were handsomely rewarded, as is discussed in the Talmud, nevertheless, that was merely the accepting. And in the days of Achashverosh, they established that which they had accepted. So we have two similar teachings on two verses here in the Megillah. They're not exactly the same. For that, you can look in I believe the appendix 2, and in the Nurturing Faith elaborates on that further. But for the purpose of understanding chapter 4, we're not going to get into it. But there are two similar interpretations on two verses in the Megillah. Either that they established what they had accepted earlier, or that they accepted in the time of Purim that which they had started at the giving of the Torah. So either way, it seems that what happened at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai was only the beginning. But and as great as that was, as we mentioned, we reference here the idea of Nasa v'Nishma, that they first said we will do, and then we will hear, and they were rewarded with crowns, as is described elsewhere. And yet, that was only the beginning. The establishment, the permanence, or the full acceptance of this of the Torah took place many centuries later, at the time of the story of Purim. Page 41. So the previous Rebbe points out in his Maimer that this seems to be wondrous. The idea that he uses the term Dvar Pella, that it's wondrous, and the Rebbe notes in a footnote here in the Hebrew Chav Dalid and in the English footnote 51, the Rebbe notes the term wonder. Generally, in Mamarim and Chassidic discourses, it says we need to understand something requires further explanation. The idea that it's a Pella, that it's a wonder, is sort of it's not an oft-used term. And so the Rebbe points out that the idea of Pella, which is the term the previous Rebbe uses in his Maimer, and the Rebbe uses it here in his as well, represents, there's mystical significance to that as well. You can read about that in footnote 51. So he says, it's a wondrous thing, which seems to defy all sense of logic. That in Matan Torah, at the time of the giving of the Torah, the Jewish people were at their height, their spiritual height. And at that point, they experienced a great divine revelation of the highest in history. The greatest revelation occurred at Mount Sinai. And if we look at it in the context of what they were experiencing at the time of the giving of the Torah, it speaks of how intense, how great the revelation was at the giving of the Torah, because they had other revelations beforehand. There was the revelation of God in Egypt, as well as the revelation of godliness that occurred at the splitting of the sea. As we know, it says that the greatest prophets, at the height of their prophecy, didn't witness what the non-Jewish maidservant witnessed at the splitting of the sea. So even those revelations were of the highest order. And yet, the revelation that occurred at Mount Sinai was an even greater revelation of godliness, when we're able to see with our own physical eyes. So, at the time of the giving of the Torah, the Jewish people were on the highest spiritual level. But in the days of Achashverosh, the Jewish people were in the lowest of levels. Because in addition to the concealment, the divine concealment that prevails during any exile, and parenthetically, the Rebbe continues that the whole Golus would be Dukmas Golus. In other words, the Rebbe is explaining that the idea of exile represents a divine concealment, because all exiles are similar to the exile of Egypt. And just as it says, the verse says, describing the hardships of the exile in Egypt, that the Jewish people could not hear Moshe, they didn't listen to him, due to their shortness of breath and harsh labor. So too, in other words, it was the very exile itself, the harshness of exile, the work, the distractions of exile that didn't allow them to hear Moshe, the words of God that Moshe was conveying to them. So too is with all exiles. That in each exile they each present their own unique challenges to studying Torah and fulfilling mitzvahs. So every exile, similar to Mitzrayim, the exile in Egypt, as he notes in Note 25, Chafei, or in the English Note 55, the Medrash says that all exiles are called Mitzrayim, since the word Mitzrayim in Hebrew comes from the root Meitzar, which means constriction. And just as in Mitzrayim, the Jewish people were squeezed in Egypt, they were oppressed, so too every exile essentially is squeezing the Jewish people, is oppressing them in whatever way. The point is that in exile, when we have distractions that get in the way, impede our service of God, that's a form of Egypt, a form of Mitzrayim, and that distracts us. So there's the natural concealment of godliness that occurs in any exile. Yet, in the time of Haman, the time of the story of Purim, the concealment was even greater. There's even a greater concealment in the times of the decree of Haman. We'll explain that in a moment. Nevertheless, in the time of Matan Torah, when the Jewish people were at the height of their spiritual achievement, that was only the beginning. And in the time of the decree of Haman, when the Jewish people were on the lowest of levels, that's when they accepted or they affirmed that which they began at the giving of the Torah. So this is a wondrous concept, that specifically at their lowest point, they should validate to such an extent something that even at their highest spiritual level, they weren't able to achieve. And the previous Rabbi in his discourse from 1927 explains the Bisman Hagzeira, in the time of the decree of Haman. What is it that allows, that makes it possible to reach this higher level of confirming or of accepting this commitment to God, reaffirming this commitment to God at the deepest of levels, that was able to occur during the time of Purim, as opposed to during the time of the giving of the Torah, it was because in the time of the decree of Haman, fulfilling Torah and mitzvahs was connected with Mesiras Nefesh, with self-sacrifice. How so? So he explains in the brackets that we know that in the Talmud says why in the book of Esther it describes the Jewish people. It refers to them as Yehudim. The Jewish people are Yehudim. Usually we're called Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, Israel, but in the Megillah they're referred to as Yehudim. Why is that? So the Gemara says that whoever denies, rejects idolatry is called a Yehudi. And so the implication from this is that during the time of Purim, when all the Jews throughout the description of that period in the book of Esther are referred to constantly as and only as Yehudim, that implies that all Jews rejected idolatry, which means that there was an opportunity for them to embrace it or to accept it, and yet they all rejected it. By rejecting it, they merited to be referred to as Yehudim. So he explains, in addition to the fact that they had Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice, not to deny God and to reject and embrace idolatry, God forbid, as the Alter Rebbe explains in his discourses in Torah, that if they were to renounce their Judaism, nothing would have happened to them. They would have been spared from Haman's decree of annihilation, because the implication is that Haman sought to annihilate all the Yehudim. It doesn't say that he sought to annihilate all of Israel or the children of Israel, the descendants of the Jewish people. It says he sought to annihilate the Yehudim. The Yehudim, meaning he wants to kill all those who accept God and renounce idolatry. Which means that had a Jew decided to renounce God, God forbid, and embrace idolatry, he would have been spared. He wouldn't have been included in this decree. It would have been a way to save themselves. Nevertheless, nobody even entertained such a thought of going that route, of saving their life by, God forbid, embracing idolatry. So in addition to that form of self-sacrifice, they had also self-sacrifice to actually observe Torah mitzvahs, not only to not passively not reject God and embrace idolatry, but also to proactively fulfill Torah mitzvahs, which is an even greater expression of self-sacrifice. To the extent that they even gathered publicly to study Torah, which requires even greater self-sacrifice. So we see that the time of Haman, the Jewish people experienced, and really for the first time in their history, they experienced to such a great extent this idea of self-sacrifice, of Mesiras Nefesh. So Mesiras Nefesh, and this inspiration, this awakening of self-sacrifice that they experienced, this occurred thanks to Mordechai the Jew, the Moshe of his generation. This then is the meaning of the way we can understand how it is that the Jewish people accepted or reaffirmed what they had begun at Matan Torah, and they accepted it specifically at the lowest point. That the time of the giving of the Torah was only the beginning, and that was confirmed and reaffirmed at the time of the decree of Haman. Through this, which during that time they actually had Mesiras Nefesh. They didn't just have a potential. It wasn't that in theory they would be willing, and would they be so inclined, or would they be challenged that they would experience Mesiras Nefesh, but they actually did have this self-sacrifice. And through that, through that, in this regard, they were able to reach a level higher than they even reached at the giving of the Torah. So at the giving of the Torah, at the height of divine revelation, the Jewish people were very holy, they were very righteous. And yet, during the time of Purim, at their lowest point, it was through their self-sacrifice that they were able to reach even beyond the level that was reached at the giving of the Torah. Thus, Thus, at that point was the acceptance, when the Jews accepted that which they began at the giving of the Torah. So this helps us clarify now the idea that we mentioned earlier at the end of chapter 3. We mentioned that Kosis Lamor, being crushed in exile, brings to Mar, to the luminary, to the source of light. So now we can understand that a little bit more. We can appreciate this idea that it is through Moshe awakening the Mesiras Nefesh and the Jewish people, this idea of self-sacrifice. It was through that self-sacrifice that they were able to reach the source of light. They were able to reach a higher level than even at the time of the giving of the Torah. So apparently we can say the meaning then of Kosis Lamor, crushed for the luminary, Kosis, that through being crushed, Nishra v'Nitka, broken and crushed in exile, Magim Lamor, we reach the luminary, the source of light, the essence. And that, why does he bring it here in his discourse, the previous year? But why does he bring it at this point in his discourse? Because it's who bir al zesha bisman akzeira dafke bol Mesiras Nefesh b'fenai l'biyosef. In other words, when he discusses in his discourse about Mordechai bringing the Jewish people to a level of Mesiras Nefesh, and he explains the idea of the Kibbul HaYehudim, that the Jewish people accepted upon themselves that, or reaffirmed that which they began at the giving of the Torah, an obvious question comes to mind, which is, why is it that specifically then, at the lowest point, could they reach such a high level? Could they achieve something that they couldn't achieve even at the giving of the Torah? So for that reason, the previous Rabbi, after that explanation, mentions this idea of Kosis Lamor, that it's through Kosis, through being crushed in exile, that we reach the source of light. We reach the essence. And by reaching the essence, that answers how it is possible for the Jewish people to have achieved something at the time of Purim that they were unable to achieve at the time of the giving of the Torah. Because self-sacrifice is something that comes from the essence of the neshama that's beyond expression, which is ma'ir. The source of light doesn't express itself. It is the source from which light comes, but it itself is beyond expression. Through that which the Jewish people at the time were crushed in exile, through that revealed the essence of their soul, ma'ir, the luminary, the source of light. So this seems to answer the question. The Rebbe is not satisfied, and he asks, nevertheless, this only explains how Kosis Lamor is introduced to answer a question that would arise from how he explains the Kibbul HaYehudim. That how is it possible that the Jewish people were able to achieve something during the time of Purim that they weren't able to achieve at the time of the giving of the Torah? But it doesn't fully explain the structure in the discourse. Let's continue, the last paragraph of chapter 4. But the sequence and ideas expressed in the previous Rebbe's Maimer, where this explanation on Kosis Lamor, that through being crushed, we get to the source of light, to the luminary, comes after he explains the concept of Raya Mehemna, that the Moshe and the offshoot of Moshe in every generation feed faith. Mashma, this implies the Inyan Kosis Lamor Shaykh Gam Lazesha Moshe Zonim Afanis Asamun Shatib Pnimis. It implies that this idea that we reach the source of light, the essence, is related to the fact that Moshe nurtures the faith. In other words, what we just explained was that he brings Kosis Lamor, the explanation of Kosis Lamor, as an explanation for why the Jewish people were able to reach a higher level at the giving of during the time of Purim, as opposed to at the giving of the Torah. But in the Maimer, he seems to imply that this idea of Kosis Lamor, that you can reach the essence, is related to the idea of Moshe nurturing the faith of the Jewish people. Or to phrase the question in other terms, the question is like this: what brings about accessing our essence? Is it being crushed in exile, or is it Moshe nurturing the faith? Which one of those two lead to the essence? So first, it seems that it's through being crushed that we reach the essence. Through being crushed and having Mesiras Nefesh, we reach the essence. But it's the crushing that leads to the essence of the soul, to the luminary. But in the Maimer, since he brings it after explaining that Moshe feeds the Jewish people faith, nurtures their faith, this implies that it's actually Moshe's nurturing the faith that leads to the luminary, that leads to the essence. So that requires further explanation, which we will address in the next class in chapter 5. In addition, in the next class, we're going to further explore this idea of faith. Today we touched on it briefly, We said that we all have a natural faith in God, and that the faith doesn't necessarily impact us on a conscious level, and Moshe's job is to get the faith to impact us on a conscious level. But the question really is it even possible for faith to affect us on a conscious level? Or would the role of faith actually be, more appropriately, something that is abstract? If faith is something that's beyond our reason, and our reason is internal, is how we operate on a conscious level, so faith being beyond it, so is it even possible for faith to enter into us on a conscious level as well? So that is something that we're going to explore in Chapter 5 in our next class. I'll take the last couple of minutes to see if there are any questions, and then we will see you all in 2 weeks, God willing, on Tuesday at 8 p.m. right back here at jnet.org/mimer. And that'll be on Tuesday, June 10th. We'll take another minute or so for questions. The chat seems a bit quiet, so with that, we will say good night and thank you for joining us.